Hi, this is Dr. Zavala. In this video, I'm going to talk about the real pandemic that we have been creating ourselves over the last 50 to 100 years. And what is this pandemic? Let me just give you a brief overview of my point of view. I've been practicing medicine and surgery for over 45 years, and during this time, I have seen how patients that come to see doctors usually are facing many medical chronic conditions. These chronic conditions can range from being overweight and obese with a consequent knee pain, back pain, patients that develop high blood pressure, that develop diabetes, that develop heart disease, that have strokes, that develop Alzheimer's, autoimmune conditions. So most of all the chronic medical conditions that doctors see around the world. Now, why is that we are seeing this epidemic of these chronic medical conditions? And usually a patient that develops, for example, high blood pressure initially is being seen for that. He gets a few pills. Pharmaceutical companies are very happy. They are selling more and more pills. But then eventually they develop renal problems, kidney problems, or they develop diabetes, or they start having problems with shortness of breath because their heart is not pumping adequately anymore, or they have a heart attack. So if you see, most of these patients in our current society have at least 3 to 4 chronic medical conditions, and we just pile them up with more and more pills. Why is that we're seeing this epidemic? Did we see this about 100 years ago? No. 100 years ago, there was really very rare to see a really overweight person. It was rare to have chronic medical conditions like heart attacks. It was rare to have patients with autoimmune conditions. And back then, the reason for people to die were infections, tuberculosis, pneumonias, poor hygiene. That has been gladly been overcome by adequate sanitation. But we have replaced that with this very poor management of chronic medical conditions. And what is the common denominator in all these chronic medical conditions? The common denominator is something that is called insulin resistance syndrome. You can call it metabolic syndrome. You can call it cardiometabolic syndrome. Whatever the name, Revens syndrome, so many different names, but they all share the same common denominator, insulin resistance. So what is this insulin resistance syndrome, and why is it so prevalent, so common in our society? There's some estimates that about 65% of the population over 45 years of age has already insulin resistance. Insulin is a critical hormone. We need it to stay alive. Type 1 diabetics that don't produce insulin really absolutely require it. Otherwise they die very soon. But insulin has many good points and many bad points. The good point, it is absolutely necessary in the low doses necessary to metabolize sugars, carbohydrates. But when we are chronically overeating carbohydrates, mostly the very common refined carbohydrates that are new to our eating habits in the last 50 years, we stimulate the production of insulin in ways that were not deemed to be appropriate in our genetics. We produce more and more levels of insulin to metabolize the growing amount of carbohydrates we are eating. And eventually, it's like asking the pancreas, that is the organ that produces the insulin, it's like asking the pancreas to do heavy push-ups continuously, trying to counteract the effects of the high carbohydrate diets that we're eating, and at the same time requiring more and more and more levels of insulin. At one time, when we have these very high levels, our bodies in general, every cell in our body starts to become resistant to the effects of insulin, and our pancreas has to work even harder. That is what is insulin resistance syndrome. And it's related, doctors diagnose that mostly based on what is the criteria for the metabolic syndrome that entails having a very large waist, over 35 in women, over 40 inches in men, having high triglycerides, having high blood pressure, having some degree of glucose intolerance, and having the good cholesterol HDL lower than it should be. That's the 5 main criteria for the diagnosis, but there are many other ways of diagnose this before it is so obvious. Why is that we are inducing insulin resistance in so many people? And I already went over this in previous videos where the food industry has really hammered us with tremendous amounts of high fructose corn syrup in every single thing you find in the market. Everything that has a label has probably high fructose corn syrup. The refined carbohydrates that are so delicious and so addictive, all that is creating a habit in us of eating more and more and more calories, but also more refined carbohydrates. And if you watch my other video about the seed oils, that adds to the fire. So it's an attack from multiple sides against our biochemistry, our way of handling food. So the reality of what we're facing today, that is the main scare that everybody has, is that the virus is killing people. And we have seen that it kills people that have pre-existing conditions. What are those pre-existing conditions? I can tell you, most of these people that are having poor outcomes from the attack of the COVID-19 are people that are very old or that have many medical conditions like obesity, like hypertension, like diabetes, like low vitamin D levels. And all these, if you look at them, are related to what my topic is, insulin resistant syndrome. So why is that we're developing this insulin resistant syndrome? I already told you is the very high carbohydrate in refined carbohydrates that we're eating. And in nature, really, protein is the building block for our cells, for all our body to build up. It never comes mixed with carbohydrates. Protein comes mixed with fat. And fat is essential for the proteins to be absorbed adequately. It increases the secretion of bile acids that are essential for adequate protein metabolism. So the only instance where you see that fat is mixed with carbohydrates is in the mother's milk. That is essential so the baby can grow. We need a high content of fat and high content of carbohydrates so the babies grow. And that's why mothers get bigger during pregnancy. It's a way of keeping our babies healthy. But at what level, at what stage are we going to cut this chronic glucose or carbohydrate mixed with fat? It's just necessary during our early years, not when we are older. So this hopefully shows you how comparing the viral epidemic with the insulin resistance epidemic is like comparing, if you like boxing, a match between a lightweight and a heavyweight. There's just no match. And sadly, the economic, health, societal consequences of not taking care of the insulin resistance syndrome is going to be incredible damage to our society and is not going to be sustainable for much longer. So in brief, a simple way of addressing this. What are the 4 pillars I consider necessary to address the insulin resistance syndrome? And by the way, it's something that we can revert. Even if all your life you've been eating inappropriately and you are causing your body to react in many different pathological ways, there's always ways to go back and at least decrease the damage that you already have. And the 4 pillars that I consider essential to avoid this progressive problem in our society is: number 1, control your carbohydrates. If you want to have carbohydrates, have complex carbohydrates, meaning not those that the food industry is refining for you to be more eager to eat them, for you to to really continue eating them despite feeling already relatively full. And these carbohydrates are there just for one purpose, to make food more chronically stable in the shelves and to make it more palatable and easier to sell and make a profit. So try to reduce or eliminate refined carbohydrates. One example of these non-refined carbohydrates or complex carbohydrates is sweet potato, for example, some fruits, mostly berries, fruits that are mixed with fat that are not as bad as the traditional mixture of carbohydrates and fat, like coconuts, avocado, olives. But in general, I would say just don't mix carbohydrates with fats. The response with insulin rise to this mixture is the worst, even more than just carbohydrates by themselves. And in general, I would say if you are going to eat fruit, don't drink the fruit. The second pillar is do not fear fat. Now, what fat am I referring to? Not the man-made fats, not the trans fats made by industry, not the fats created in the seed oils to make you sick. Eat whole food fats. What are those whole food fats? Are olive oil, are avocado oil, are coconuts, olives again, if you want to go vegetarian most of the time, and obviously animal fat like the fat that comes with your ribeye, the fat that comes in the skin with the chicken, the fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, sardines, and try to eliminate all the fats like margarines, of course, that are now out of the shelves, and try to really eat just whole foods, including the fats that they contain. The third pillar of a good nutrition is having a good protein intake. Proteins at the right dosage, I would say at least 1 to 1.5 grams per kilo of body weight is the least amount of protein you need. The protein is the building block in your body, and the more nutritious protein you have, the better it will be absorbed. If you compare proteins in meats and animal products versus proteins in vegetables, there's just no comparison. Again, a heavyweight versus a lightweight. I don't think veganism is the best way to be nourished. If you insist on being a vegetarian, I understand it for moral reasons. My own daughter has that situation. She dedicates her life to rescuing animals and trying to make their lives more comfortable. And I understand that, and I agree in many of those situations. But from the nutritious standpoint, if you are going to be a vegetarian, at least try to modify your diet, eating eggs and fish as much as you can. If the concern you have is from a moral standpoint, I agree with you. Try to get to know your local farmers. Try to buy meat that is pasture-raised, animals that have been treated humanely and not in big feedlots. And hopefully you can find this kind of meat and avoid the continued mistreatment of animals. Now, going back to the four pillars I mentioned initially, I would say that the fourth pillar of a good nutrition is fasting. At least what's called intermittent fasting. I call it intermittent eating because you are not eating all day like the standard American diet is encouraging you, like many nutritionists that are giving you 3 main foods with 2 or 3 snacks. I think that's just absurd. Intermittent fasting, in my personal life, what I do is once a day meals. I eat only at night. And I think from my personal standpoint, what I've seen in some of my patients and friends and family is that eating much less frequently makes you feel so much better. The brain functions better, your strength increases, and you reduce a lot of the consequences of this chronic overeating. Now, what is the real choice? Are you going to go with a keto diet, or are you going to go just with a low carb diet, or are you going to go with a high protein diet? The first thing, just avoid the standard American diet. If you can avoid the standard American diet, any other diet, including vegetarian diets, can be better. The standard American diet is where you eat pretty much just refined foods, a lot of seed oils, many meals a day. That is just not healthy. So if you are going to choose between one and the other, I would say if you are healthy or you think you are still healthy, a low carbohydrate diet, paleo type, with vegetables, hopefully those that are less insulinogenic, like avoiding rice, potatoes, very sweet fruits, prefer berries, for example. That is a healthy diet. But if you already have a medical condition, I would say, for example, you have an autoimmune condition, or you have a problem with very long-standing diabetes, difficult to manage, I would be very intense in trying to go with a much more aggressive diet, like the ketogenic diet in some instances, where ketones can protect your brain from getting further damage. In that instance, you probably will like to go into a high ketosis state. But in general, for healthy or apparently healthy people, just a low carbohydrate diet with adequate protein, with adequate animal fats, with whole foods is what I would recommend. I will tell you in future videos, this is a longer video, I don't want to bore you with this, but in future videos I will give you brief examples of the way I think we should be eating to avoid the consequences of this pandemic that we're facing. If you think this video was helpful to you and you think it can help your family and friends, please share it with them, and please subscribe to our channel so future videos you can get direct access to them. Thank you very much.